is joining us from Ithaca, New York, where a small town in upstate New York, where I spent some years while I was doing my PhD there. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Geethika Dharmasinghe I'm hoping that I pronounced it right, from Cornell University. And she's going to be talking, her talk is titled, Who is Force is Violence? Sangha, Governance and Authority. And of course, I will first introduce her to you more. As I said, she's joining us from Cornell University from the United States, and she's a PhD candidate in the Department of Asian Studies. And with the support of Venergram Foundation, she finished her fieldwork in Sri Lanka in 2019. And the larger question that hovers over her dissertation concerns the relationship with Buddhists to violence, which seems like a very, very interesting topic to me. And it examines the conditions of possibilities for the emergence of Buddhist violence located outside state control. The floor is yours, Geethika. I will just remind that I will remind you in the chat box when your time is approaching to 15 minutes. So you can start now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for accepting my abstract also. And I'm very happy to be here. I'll start for my paper, Whose Force is Violence, Sangha, Governance of the Sovereignty and Authority. The ethnographic materials are gathered from Sri Lanka. Those of you who don't know much about Sri Lanka, it's a Sinhala Buddhist majoritarian country. Sinhala is an ethnic identity. Buddhism, of course, is religion, right? It's a ethnic religious identity. The Sinhala Buddhists are the majority of the country. And we have Tamils, and 18% of the population. And we have Muslims, 9% of the population. So in the recent times, the groups and organizations, particularly led by monks, have started demonizing Muslims as they're a threat to the country. So this paper is an attempt to think about monks' authority, in particular their ability to suspend the state's legal order as a form of legitimized violence in Sri Lankan society. The newly emerged groups engage and authorize a new monastic discourse in which they demand for state sovereign power. These groups and their political actions, hunger strikes, protest and violence against minority communities, especially Muslims, are able to disable the state order. However, these acts are rarely considered violent by the majority of Sinhalese Buddhists. It is my contention that monks' authority as a force has been legitimized in the Sinhala Buddhist tradition of Sri Lanka. Hence, their actions come to be interpreted or glossed as not violent. In short, it is an attempt to understand how what counts as violence and what does not emerge in a given society. Let me begin with a brief story about a fast as a departure point for our discussion on Sangha's authority and violence. Sangha means the monastic order in Sri Lanka, the Buddhist monks and the whole institution. June 3rd, 2019, organized masses across Sri Lanka took to the streets in support of Athuliye Ratanathero, a famous parliamentarian monk who had begun a hunger strike. He's a pioneer of the newly emerged national movement, which aims to consolidate state power in the hands of monks. Sitting on the footstep of Dalanda Maligawa, the island's iconic Buddhist temple, Ratanathero demanded the resignation of a Muslim cabinet minister and 2 Muslim governors alleged to have suicide bombers who carried out series of bombing attacks on Easter Sunday, killing over 250 people and injuring 500 others. As the monks' health began to visibly deteriorate, on the 4th day, deteriorate on the fourth day of fasting, his demands gained traction through the media as the circulation of grief, anger, and despair seemed to inspire many. From the morning of the fourth day of the fast, the media disseminated coverage of politicians and prominent monks in towns and cities all over the country who were also engaging in hunger strikes in support of Ratanathero. At an end of media scene, Gnanasara Thero, another Buddhist monk who had already gained prominence in the country by his repeated language of Muslim expansionism and Muslim fundamentalism, spoke, underscoring the need for Muslim politicians to resign. I cannot give up the life of the feeble Ratanathero for the three crook politicians, he said. What is played out here is the expression of ultimatum, at least in the eyes of the majority of Sinhala Buddhists and the monks. The life of a monk is not a life that can be sacrificed. It must be saved at the cost of Muslim politicians' careers. He was wading into the deep water in Sinhalese majoritarian society in authorizing certain sentiments, perceived ideological and cultural hierarchy, organized around Sinhalese being the sole owners of the country and Muslims as aliens. So the sensibility of Ratana's act was clear to the Sinhala Buddhists. They draw the boundaries between the life that matters the most, that of the Sinhala Buddhist, and the life that does not, that of the Muslim. Thus, throughout the strike, the subtext seemed to be which life matters, not a question, but rather a decision which bears the character of sovereignty or a capacity to define who matters, who does not, who is disposable, who is not, as Mumbai would say. So it did not come as much of a surprise that on the fourth day of Ratanathero's hunger strike, at around 2 p.m., a letter was circulated through social media, conveying the news that 9 Muslim cabinet ministers and 2 Muslim governors, all the Muslim representatives who held state power, had resigned as a response to the events taking place in the country. The event signified the latent force within monks and state submission to them. It was an insurrectionary act, not in the Marxian sense of a violent takeover of state power, but his act was aimed at state power and interrupted it. The state surrendered. The repeated remarks about willingness to die for the country, nation, and Buddhism are a prominent part of the discourse of the recently emerged groups and organizations. This willingness to die by the Sangha bears a great deal of force, a possibility for the emergence of violence, which unarguably characterizes any sovereign act. The sovereign acts bear the condition of possibility for production of disposable lives. Ratanathero, through his hunger strike, performs a condition of possibility of violence on his body, the death on his own being, by claiming to become a sovereign. George Bataille's critical insight on death that informed sovereignty is important for the point I make here. For Bataille, there are multiple forms of sovereignty, but ultimately it is the refusal to accept the limits that the fear of death would have us respect in order to ensure, in a general way, the laboriously peaceful life of individuals. This sovereign has no more regard for the limits of identity than he does for limits of death, or rather, these limits are the same. He is the transgression of all such limits. It is a call for strength to violate the prohibition against killing. In my view, this radical readiness to violate the prohibition, not killing, and expends one's own life, the death, which is irreversible, the sovereign practice is what Ratanathero performed. Further, Ratanathero here, by suspending the legal order of the state, expands the boundaries of sovereign violence and reveals the limits of the state monopoly on violence. He also denies the sentiments that it controls or the prohibition against killing, a fundamental Buddhist teaching. Thus, it is not only this treatment of sovereignty as the violation of prohibitions that I assume to contend that monks' claim to be sovereign is embedded, a condition of possibility for violence, but also the willingness to put their form of life at risk by violating a fundamental precept that they were expected to observe as a bhikkhu, as a monk, a son of Buddha, not kill. Strikingly, however, the crucial point that I wish to point out through this event is, for the majority of the country, Ratana's Act that suspended the state's legal order put their monkhood as a form of life into question and made resign Muslims, all the Muslims outside of legal order, was not appeared as an act of violence. I ask why. It is common knowledge that in contemporary states, this kind of insurrectionary political act against the state rarely ends up with the state surrendering to the protesters completely. Hence, it could have been considered a violent act. In this context, however, Ratana's Act did not constitute violence except in the minds of a few politicians and a handful of liberals and leftists. In fact, no one took the issue to courts as an offense against Muslims, even as a gesture of a just society. In other words, my task here is to discuss why Ratanathero's acts and its ramifications were widely applauded by the Sinhala majority of the country, whose pronouncements, both before and after Ratanathero's intervention, repeatedly denounced Muslim violence. How does the distinction between what counts as violence and what does not count as violence emerge? To answer these questions, I turn to Pradeep Jagannathan's great insight in his essay, When Words Will Not Do, Theravada Buddhism and the Emergence of Violence. Here he suggests that what counts as violence emerges when force breaks through its legitimizing frame. In other words, force, the condition of possibility for violence, is circumscribed within the legitimizing frame. A frame is a code in the sense of both rule or law, which can be thought of as symbolic, moral, ethical, or political. Delving into the relationship between Buddhism and violence, Jagannathan critically follows Walter Benjamin's insight about force and the emergence of violence in his famous 1921 essay, Critique of Violence, which has become a point of reference in disciplinary investigations of violence, informing his argument. The main insight Jagannathan points out in Benjamin's work is that both force and violence, as in the sense of harm, cannot be separated from the legitimizing framework. Benjamin uses the German word Gewalt that has been translated into English as violence. Derrida, in his famous essay, The Force of Law, points out that the translation of Benjamin's text into English has not taken into account the fact that Gewalt also signifies for Germans legitimate power, authority, and public force. He further writes that Gewalt then is not only violence, but legitimized power and justified authority. So it not only represents violence in the sense of harm, but also force that can perform violence, hence a condition of possibility for violence. So Benjamin, Gewalt is also always internal to the category of law, the legitimizing framework. In other words, Gewalt is latent within law and intimately bound to it. The point I'm laboring to make here by delineating the parameters of the Gewalt is that it allows us to see the possibility of conceiving violence not just as an end in itself, a violation or infringement, but also as an authority or force that enables the violation as a means. More importantly, Jagannathan reminds us that Benjamin's insight in his formulation of Gewalt means and ends separate. Thus, it enables us to see the expressiveness of violence and the violence latent within the forms as conceptually distinct. I shall now focus on the efficacy of a strike, a political event which is considered legitimates violence in contemporary Sri Lanka, allowed by citizens of that modern state. as witnessed by the incident of Ratanathero discussed above, to reveal the great deal of force Sangha bear in singular Buddhist tradition and how this force is being legitimized within this tradition as I would say it's a kind of a legitimizing framework. So efficacy of Ratanathero's fast. The efficacy of a strike is that it reminds the state of the founding violence, the lawmaking violence that it bears. Hence, the modern state absorbs this power that prevails outside of the state by accepting right to strike. So it shares its monopoly of violence with its citizens. It is this legitimizing frame, one can argue, that permitted Ratanathero in our story to perform his hunger strike as a not violent act. However, the point I'm laboring to make cannot rest here as another legitimizing framework that works in this context. Though the Sri Lankan government often violently responds to the protesters by use of tear gas, water cannons, shooting, and at times even murder, using its law-preserving violence, police and army and all these things, due to the possibility of violence borne by these strikers. When monks are involved in the strikes and put their life at risk, the government, not always, but often concede. Monks in general share a great deal of authority in Sri Lanka. This has been justified not only within the singular Buddhist tradition, through many number of quotidian rituals and practices, the areas of violent simplification, as David Graeber would say, but also by the legal frame of the Sri Lankan state, giving the foremost place to Buddhism in the constitution. Given the singular Buddhist tradition, for instance, a monk and a lay person are not equal because they are not because they are legally unequal to each other, but because of a crucial sense of the tradition. Some of these practices, for instance, clergy are dedicated to priority seating in the public transportation system and at public events. Women, in no occasion, will seat alongside with them. Lay people will rise from their seats when they appear and will always assume lower seating, irrespective of one's social and political status. Every political party leader, despite their ethnic or religious status, pays a visit to Mahanayaka, the chief prelates of the three main religious chapters, when they get elected to public office. Actually, there is no legal punishment for not performing these rituals, though one will have to go through a social pressure for failing to do so, a continuous social gaze, public critique through various media, an advice, a demand, or asked to leave, forms of enforcement that inevitably carry a sense of established authority. It is the virtue of any respectable citizen arising from what Mauss called habitus, an embodied capacity that is more than physical ability, in that it also includes cultivated sensibilities and fashions and orchestration of the senses. In short, the Sri Lankan state cannot let Ratanathero die easily when he interrupts the public political social order by performing the death of his life. So monks' acts, such as Ratana's strike, are able to suspend the legal order. They are not often considered as violent, thus rarely take legal actions. This impossibility reveals the limits of state sovereignty, rather than state being complete impotent organ, as many have seemed to claim. Indeed, these limits of state sovereignty are contingent and reveal at times when its power is not threatened. So it is not the norm of the country, but ironically, those who are in power always are the singular Buddhist majority. Hence, most often, Sangha's authority matters. Hence, my broad argument, concluding, I would say, is that it is a legitimizing frame that one needs to take into consideration to understand what counts as violence, what does not emerge in any given society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geethika, for this conceptually rich talk, and you gave us a lot of food for thought. I'm sure there's going to be many, many questions. Now we are going to listen to our second speaker before moving to the discussions, and of course the third speaker as well. And our speaker is now Marcos Mendoza. He's joining us from the University of Mississippi, where he works as an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And Marcos Mendoza, I hope I am pronouncing your name right. Okay, great. Okay, Marcos Mendoza received his doctorate at the University of Chicago, and his work straddles the intersection of political ecology, legal anthropology, and economic anthropology. Mendoza's first book project focused on Argentine resource politics, risk subjectivity, and the green economy. And this resulted in the Pantagonian Sublime, the Green Economy and Post-Neoliberal Politics, which came out from Rutgers University Press in 2018. Mendoza is currently conducting ethnographic and archival research in Mexico on self-defense, insecurity, legal culture, contentious politics, and organized crime. Hence, he's in our workshop, which is very much related to these topics. And his work has been published in various forms, such as dialectical anthropology, not forms, in various forums or venues, including Dialectical Anthropology, the Bulletin of Latin American Research, and the Journal of Latin American Geography. And the floor is yours, Marcos.
Okay, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Let me go ahead and pull up my slides. All right. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and give this talk. The title of my presentation is Unarmed Partisans, Tactical Vigilantism and Religious Piety in Michoacán, Mexico. And what I'm going to do is the presentation is going to cover the topic of the political after effects of vigilante violence. I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the scholarship on vigilantism in Mexico, then talk a bit about the concept of the partisan, and then focus on a case study from the village where I'm doing my research called Ucareo. So scholarship on vigilantism in Mexico has really positioned vigilantism as emerging in response to escalating violence, to organized crime, and to the co-optation of state actors and institutions by criminal organizations. And specifically in the Western sources that have received a great deal of scholarship. First, there's the community police forces known as the Rondas Comunitarias or the Policía Comunitaria. And then secondly, the self-defense militias, which are known as autodefensas. Now, with respect to community police forces, these refer to indigenous communities in the Meseta Purépecha region. They were mobilized to defend villages and towns from criminal predation from around settlements. The autodefensa militias, by contrast, emerged in mestizo settlements in the Tierra Caliente, Sierra Sur, and Costa regions. And there'll be a map on the next slide that shows you where these regions are in Michoacán. These emerged to really defend homes from criminal predation like the community police forces. But what's different is that they combined to form a regional militia front. And this regional militia front kind of mobilized to attack one particular drug cartel called the Caballeros Templarios, which translates as the Templar Knights. And so from 2013 to 2014, this regional militia group marched from municipality to municipality with this force numbering around 20,000 individuals. Not surprisingly, this regional militia front was problematic for the government. The government first denounced it, then they tried to co-opt it, tried to regularize it, to bring it under the state, and to kind of demobilize the militias and to create instead a rural defense force. And then they arrested those who did not agree to do this. This offensive against the cartel really stalled out in mid to late 2014. And as a result, new cartels came in behind the militias and moved into these vacated territories, the territories vacated by the Caballeros Templarios. So I'm doing research in the northeastern part of the state in the village of Ucareo. And as you can see, if you look on the eastern side of Michoacán, there's no, it's really not known for vigilante groups, right? Ucareo is a mestizo farming village of approximately 2,300 residents. Ucarao has a recent history of organized crime. So there's three cartels that really set up limited forms of governance, uneven extortion, resource pillaging from 2004 to 2014. But from 2014 to 2015, there was also an independent small band of gangsters that operated in the area in tandem with the municipal police force that engaged in kidnappings, ransoms, and also perpetrated sexual violence against female captives. In response to this, a group of residents in Ucarao organized a vigilante force to deal with the problem. And this all came to a head on Thursday, July 2nd, 2015. Two gunmen from this group captured two residents from the village, Mateo and Gonzalo Roca. They released Gonzalo, and he went to go organize the payment of the ransom to release Mateo. This happened outside of the town cemetery. And as the payment was happening, this vigilante force encircled the cemetery. There was a brief gunfight that happened, and then eventually they captured the two gangsters. Now, what happened next, there's two kind of competing narratives about this. The narrative coming from the Ucarenses said that they called the municipal police force and that they beat up the men, but that they were alive when they gave them to the police. State investigators, by contrast, argue that the vigilante force drugged them down a dirt road and then lynched them. And the following morning, the two bodies were discovered hanging from a highway overpass. So this kind of triggering incident created a series of political consequences. The police came to Ucarao and arrested 5 suspects. 2 of those suspects were psychologically coerced into signing statements implicating the other 3 people, who just happened to be first cousins, and I call them the Roca cousins. The cousins were then to stand trial for double homicide in 1 week's time, so only had a 1 week to prepare their legal defense, I know. The police then were expected to return to Ucarao to arrest more people. So the day after the arrest took place, the villagers rung the emergency church bells. Hundreds of people assembled in the town square and began to organize a political campaign to free the cousins and to defend the pueblo. So the argument I'm making in this presentation is that this political campaign that developed up through the trial generated a vision of the people engaged in unarmed protest that's really informed by the values of agrarian Catholicism. And this campaign engaged in what I would call tactical vigilantism. This is to say that actors draw selectively upon existing regional models of vigilantism, namely the community police forces and the auto-defensive militias. So selectively drawing upon the tactics of these groups to develop a situated response to an emergency situation. So this essentially, I'm approaching vigilantism, as some of the other panelists have done, as a processual field, informed by historical models of radical action and collective justice seeking. Now, to think through vigilantism specifically in Mexico, I'm using what I call the anthropology of the partisan. Now, in the literature, there's 2 kind of key concepts of the partisan that you're probably familiar with. The first one is the one that we're most familiar with that comes from the political science literature. This refers to engagement in conventional political spaces, members of political parties. We could also push beyond that to think about other types of civil society actors as partisan actors as well, environmental activists, racial justice movements, even nationalist groups as being partisan actors. Now, there's a second notion of the partisan as well. This refers to irregular armed civilians defending the homeland. This transpires within unconventional political spaces defined by states of war, states of occupation, or civil war, or I would argue widespread criminal predation as occurs in Mexico. An enemy becomes the focus of the armed civilian struggle. And these partisans engage in the defense of villages. They might engage in intelligence gathering and sabotage, as well as in the participation in militias. So what I'm proposing is a unified conception of the partisan. So bringing these 2 kind of disparate ideas together. The partisan is occupying a very deeply ambiguous political and legal space, so that social groups can kind of shift between the poles of conventional and unconventional partisan action. So social groups typically engage in conventional partisan action. We vote, we go attend protests, we go on strikes, we have assemblies, etc. But people may also adopt unconventional partisan actions during emergencies, create defensive shields, seize the power of policing, and use lethal violence. Moreover, social groups can blend both types of actions, so both armed mobilization and unarmed civilian resistance. So in my work, I'm really studying what I call the figuration of the partisan, how partisan figures create resonant visions of the people in opposition to enemy antagonists, and how political actors essentially select and elevate different identities, virtues, and notions of victimhood or victimization to build a social basis of support. So in Ucareo, the residents really engaged with two kind of narratives of vigilantism, one from the state and one from the media. The state painted them as criminally responsible for the lynchings. The governor at the time and the governor-elect both criticized Ucarenses for having taken justice into their own hands. The media kind of built upon this state narrative, but then framed Ucareo as having formed an autodefensa group, so explicitly drawing upon this kind of regional history. Initially, they thought that they were armed actors, and then they eventually recognized that they were unarmed actors. In response to these two kind of discourses of vigilantism from the state and the media, Ucarenses organized their political campaign over the course of the week and used a series of tactics. The first of which was erecting barricades. The barricade is, of course, a tactic that's used by many groups, but was also explicitly used by autodefensas and community police forces in Michoacán. So Ucarenses shut down the entrances to the village. They used rudimentary materials like tires or bricks to build these barricades. The residents took shifts at the barricades, and very explicitly, there were no guns. They used instead rudimentary tools like shovels and machetes in some cases. And essentially, they were barring entry to the police using their bodies. And so these barricades symbolized the image of unarmed protest, but also the creation of a free territory subject to popular sovereignty. Now, I should also note that the populace had access to guns, but these were kept hidden, right? They were kept out of sight. Media tactics. So there was a group of leaders that were designated to give media interviews and to engage in political negotiations as need be. These leaders worked to create a counter discourse to the state and media narratives based on community victimization by organized crime and by the state. And these leaders worked to really kind of reinforce this idea that Ucarenses had not created an autodefensa, nor had they created a community police force. They were something different. Thirdly, they organized protest marches in the state capital. The slogan that they used was Paz y Libertad para Ucareo, peace and freedom for Ucareo. And of course, there was an image of a dove holding an olive branch right next to this slogan. The religious symbolism to this that was evident to the protesters referred to the biblical account of Noah's Ark, a kind of catastrophic purification myth. And it signaled that Ucarenses were essentially situated at the moment within a world of sin, of violence and corruption, as was Mexico more broadly. And so the ark in this metaphor, the ark of salvation from sin was essentially the embracing of radical peace, of radical nonviolence. In addition to this, you can see the main banner says Peaceful Ucarense March for freedom, peace, and justice. Again, peace kind of reinforcing the notion of nonviolence, freedom as referring to the liberated territory of Ucareo, but also the central demand of the movement, that is to say, the return of the Roca cousins. Justice referring to protests against its unjust incarceration, and of course the Ucarenses referring to the protesters themselves. Now, another main tactic used by the movement was to cloak the movement in religious piety. Ucarenses are almost uniformly Catholic, and so the movement leaders, right after the arrests took place, they approached the village priest, and there's only one church, I should add. And they explained that no villagers had participated in the lynching. The priest believed them and announced his support for the movement, and so really lent the institutional support of the church. And so the Catholic faith was a very central pillar of support for the movement as it emerged. And in terms of embracing this ideology of nonviolence, this was a very kind of politically astute way to generate mass support. It really aligned the protest ideology with Catholic moral virtue and, kind of connoted protesters turning the other cheek symbolically. Over the course of the week, their social base of support grew. There's a number of Ucarenses who have left Ucareo and moved to other parts of Mexico, have moved to the United States, and have moved to Canada. And so these transnational remittance networks were really important in funneling money to pay for food, to pay for buses, to feed the people at the barricades, to pay for the buses that were transporting protesters into Morelia every day. other villages from the surrounding area also joined the movement. And so they sent people to man the barricades. They sent people to the protest marches in Morelia. The movement also received support from a left-wing unionist movement based out of Morelia. And on the day of the trial, 2,000 activists from this group staged in central Morelia, so that if there was a guilty verdict, they were going to shut it down completely, and then potentially escalate the situation. Lastly, there was an implicit threat of armed struggle. Essentially, the leaders intimated the possibility of arming the populace for defense. And so really kind of taking advantage of the governor's fear of the potential reemergence of the autodefensa militias in other parts of the state and the violence spreading into the eastern region, which had remained peaceful until now. While the trial was marred by significant irregularities, the witnesses ultimately retracted their statements. And so the Roca cousins were ultimately released for lack of evidence. Not surprisingly, there was a celebratory march that occurred in Ucarau, and this was capped by a mass. Ucarenses in the aftermath really demanded autonomy from the municipal police force and essentially became a pueblo without police. Ucarenses, moreover, at the direction of the priests, built shrines at all the places where the barricades had been placed to commemorate the event, and essentially entreating Ucarenses to forgive and pursue the path of peace. And you can see an example on the slide here. So in conclusion, I've focused on the political after effects of vigilante violence, seeing it as a kind of a triggering event for a series of escalating events, and really focusing on the formation of a partisan figure grounded in existing histories of vigilantism, religious faith, and an ideology of nonviolence, and really mobilizing this motif of Catholic piety to build a base of social support, and also for the villagers to deny their involvement in the lynching. And what I'm suggesting is that they're constructing a really ambiguous partisan figure here that straddles both domains, both the domain of conventional political action and unconventional armed civilian action. These were unarmed partisans, but they had the potential to embrace violence given the associations widespread that they had actually committed the lynching. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this extremely rich, I'm sorry, can you hear me? Okay, because it says unstable. Okay, now connection is back. Thank you very much for this extremely ethnographically rich talk and which opens up very important theoretical questions, and it nicely speaks to our conversation from yesterday after keynote speech, the importance of religion in making of vigilante violence and the entanglements between religion, history, and shifting modes of governance, let's say. Now we are going to listen to our third speaker, Salman Hussain. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yes, it's correct. Yeah.
Okay, I will introduce you first and then I will give the floor to you. Salman Hussain is joining us from Canada, from North America again, and he's the postdoctoral fellow in Anthropology department at York University. And he completed his PhD in cultural anthropology at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, CUNY, and has held dissertation writing and visiting research fellowships in law and anthropology department at Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, and has taught at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His research has been published in Polar, Political and Legal Anthropology Review, Postcolonial Studies, Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power, and Anthropological. And his talk is titled Miracles of the State, Blasphemy and Forced Disappearance in Pakistan. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, thanks, of course, to the organizers, and I'll jump right into it. Just a quick note is that, this is, of course, work in progress. It's one of the earliest drafts, and what I'm attempting to do here is to bring two projects that I'm working on. One is the older one, which is looks at I mean, how politics of dissent intersect with politics of terror at the site of 4 disappearances, in Pakistan by way of contributing to anthropology of the state, and the other one looks at blasphemy laws and what we will call vigilante violence around it. And it's just, I think, a very rough and shed attempt to bring these two together. Okay, I'll jump right into it. So German legal theorist Carl Schmitt famously defined the notion of exception in jurisprudence as analogous to miracle in theology. All notable concepts in the modern theory of state, he argued, are secularized theological concepts. Miracle, Schmitt suggested, is a transgression of the laws of nature through direct intervention, similar to the sovereign's intercession in the legal order of the modern state. In his reformulation of the Hobbesian state, Schmitt draws out the central paradox of sovereignty. It constantly needs other, often unlawful and violent means, in other words, transgressions, for its own legitimacy and expression. Examining vigilantly violence on the charges of blasphemy and enforced disappearances in Pakistan, this paper reflects the dual nature of sovereignty and questions the realist notion of the state. The power of the state in its mythical aura, the paper suggests, is drawn from spaces of violence and terror where the boundaries between legal and illegal are blurred. From this perspective, the state does not appear as a product of rational technologies of control, but as a subject of excess that bypasses any rational functionality. Violent transgressions, often lacking precise agents, evidence, and explanations, and spreading awe and fear, feed the aura of the state. Below, I expand on these reflections by examining how new liberal notions of surveillance and citizenship and various forms of self-regulation in digital social media and elsewhere blasphemy laws to punish transgressors in Pakistan. And of course, because of the restrictions of time, I'll be only touching upon these elements. So the events, what are the main events that I'm looking at ethnographically? In late 2016, several social media activists publicly identified as quote unquote secular and liberal mysteriously disappeared in Pakistan. What was common amongst them was their public critique of the Pakistani military and intelligence apparatus. Soon after their disappearance, allegations of blasphemy were circulated against them in the media. They were accused of posting blasphemous speech on Facebook. After a few weeks, these activists returned allegedly from the custody of the intelligence services and retreated from the public sphere. Months later, they broke their silence to claim that they were tortured while unlawfully detained by the intelligence services. During the disappearance of these activists, the Sunni Barelvi, and it's one of the sects of Sunni Islam, cleric Khadim Hussain Rizvi, who a few months later would lead a sit-in to protest amendments in the blasphemy laws and mobilized another protest 2 years later, endorsed the abduction of the liberal bloggers and encouraged those holding them to punish and kill them in custody. After all, Section 295C of the Pakistani Penal Code, which deals with blasphemy, suggests death as the punishment for defiling the sacred name of the Prophet. Rizvi's public endorsement of state violence against secular activists was one of the first instances to depict how state institutions and their shadowy religious sympathizers openly weaponize blasphemy to discipline political dissent and religious transgressions in Pakistan. A few months later, and this is still in 2016, hundreds of students brutally beat and shot a fellow student to death on a university campus in Mardan. It's a city in northwestern Pakistan. The victim, Mashal Khan, was also accused of committing blasphemy. His accusers claimed he had posted blasphemous speech on social media. Mashal had denied these allegations a few days before his death. He alleged that a fake Facebook account had been created in his name and that those handling the account had been posting obscene speech. Mashal was beaten with wooden sticks and steel pipes by fellow students, shot by one of them, and then dragged down the stairs outside his hostel. The attackers in hundreds continued to beat, kick, and spit on his lifeless body until a few police responders eventually secured his corpse. And an investigation conducted by the police cleared Mashal Khan of any charges of blasphemy and concluded that his killing was a premeditated murder. It further revealed that his death was planned by some members of his university's administration and some students because he was so critical of the university bureaucracy. However, the reduction of Mashal's murder to a pre-planned conspiracy also disregards how violence on charges of blasphemy flares up and how it is managed by the state. The idea of a rational, calculated plan implies the role of a few provocateurs who incite the emotions of others to the point of violence. The emotional aspect of blasphemy, that it could invoke uncontrollable emotions in all Muslims towards the alleged blasphemer, is an inherent part of the violence situated within blasphemy law. And I discussed this later in the paper. So this paper deliberates on what these violent events tell us about the dual sovereignty of the modern state and its miraculous forms. In examining the nature, exercise, and representation of modern state power, I question the assumption that state sovereignty is unitary and singularly exercised by means of formal legal institution based on the rule of law, and suggest investigating the paradoxical ways in which fragmented forms of sovereignty are exercised, complemented, and contested, rather than placing the disappearance of human rights activists and collective violence against alleged blasphemer outside of the law as exceptions. I suggest these acts are constitutive of modern law and political order, as they caution the populace of the larger spectral structures of power and act as a necessary reminder to maintain obedience and order. So a note on the background, disappearances and the unlawfulness of, or the lawfulness of violence. The relationship between open political process and secret covert action, anthropologist Josepha Zuleika argues, invokes dual sovereignty. If overt politics is based on rule of law, covert politics is grounded in the magic of secret action and the mysticism of evil powers that must be confronted without legal restraints. The tendency to theologize political conflicts, to transform others as representative of forces of evil and to subject them to unrestrained state violence, at the part of the discourse on national security and the so-called war on terrorism, enforced disappearances, the rendition of terrorist suspects by intelligence agencies, the labeling of prisoners of war as enemy combatants, and the subsequent denial of their fundamental rights shaped the new regime of violence and surveillance that was globally enacted after 9/11. So secret abduction carried out by the intelligence services are a new part of a regime of surveillance, discipline, and punishment operative in Pakistan today. These actions of the state's intelligence apparatus parallel the vigilantism of political ambiguous religious groups that legitimize their violence in reference to the securing of Namus-e-Risalat, which roughly translates as Prophet Muhammad's dignity and honor. However, the weaponization of blasphemy, both by the state as well as political and military groups, takes place not in the absence, as I've said before, but in the shadow of the blasphemy laws that the British had first introduced in 1860 as crimes against religion. So, blasphemy laws and the management of public emotions and religious feelings. Chapter 15 of the Pakistan Penal Code deals with crimes regarding religion. 5 additional clauses were added during General Ziaul Haq's military rule. I mean, he ruled from 1977 to 1988, and it was around 1984-85 that these new clauses were added. Of these, Section 295C deems the desecration of the Prophet's name as punishable by death. Other laws, often referred to as blasphemy laws, concern the Ahmadiyya minority and their claims to Muslim identity. The Pakistani post-colonial state inherited and has kept the Indian Penal Code of 1860 intact, but it's important to note that the colonial inclusion of Chapter 15 of which was titled as of offenses relating to religion in the Penal Code was intended for the maintenance of law and order. It is important to note that these laws apply to all religions and not only to Islam. It is also important to consider that even as colonial laws did indeed speak of injury to religious feelings, it was the intention behind the act that was to be carefully examined in the charges of blasphemy. Conversely, in the post-colonial period, the provocation of religious emotions has become the major impetus in the invocation of blasphemy laws and not the intention. It was during General Zia's regime that blasphemy laws became reflective of the rise and appeasement of the traditional middle classes in the urban areas mostly, and in the broader project I go into it that how these classes are now more and more active on digital media. And so it's a kind of digital vigilantism. The blasphemy laws intend to regulate wounded attachments to the Prophet. In other words, as Asad Ahmed, the anthropologist who has worked on blasphemy laws in Pakistan, suggests both colonial and post-colonial blasphemy laws constitute a structure of incitement and regulation. Feelings must be wounded or injured for the charges of blasphemy to be initiated. In other words, religious sensibilities must be wounded by a particular speech or action for the blasphemy law to take effect. The transgressions of the state's shadowy intelligence agencies and the collective violence incited by Sunni clerics to punish alleged blasphemer therefore finds legitimacy in what the blasphemy laws asks the accuser to affirm, that attests that your feelings have been wounded and blasphemous speech has invoked you to violence. The rise of Sunni Barelvi religious figures and the injured public emotions that they have been able to command by invoking and claiming to protect prophets' dignity and honor became particularly noticeable when one of these clerics began to lead protests to demand punishment for alleged blasphemers. The collective emotions and the mobilizations, a number of which resulted in the killing of those accused of blasphemy, proved the reach and power in the slogan of blasphemy to command public passions and the moral authority of the crowds. The funeral of Mumtaz Qadri, and this was a police guard who assassinated governor of one of the provinces back in 2011. So his funeral attracted hundreds of thousands of mourners, and his grave became a shrine of a martyr. And in the larger project, I go into in detail on how the courts I look at the judgment in which he was given the capital punishment, but the judgment itself is most fascinating to read, because that's where you see how the notion of emotions is understood in the legal liberal discourse and so on. So anyway, I'll just continue with this for now. A prominent Sunni cleric, Rizvi, and this is the guy who I had alluded to before, who had mobilized protests for the release of Qadri, this police guard who had assassinated the governor. So he mobilized for mobilized protests for Qadri's release around 2011 and 12. And it's interesting that how he defines his relationship with this, with Qadri, right? So Rizvi legitimized his leadership in protecting the honor of the Prophet from Qadri's sacrifice and his identification with him. In fact, in one of his speeches, Rizvi alluded to the miraculous nature of his relationship with Qadri. He claimed that Qadri visited him and was present with him when both were locked in prisons located miles apart. Both are bounded, he claimed, in their love for the Prophet, and it was a miracle of their meeting with Qadri, of their meeting while Qadri was imprisoned, that tied them. Rizvi reserves his ire for the liberals and their westernized allies who intend to change the blasphemy laws. He invites the state, especially its military and intelligence services, to act as true Muslim patriots and violently eliminate the blasphemers and stop conspiracies to amend the blasphemy laws. And it is in this invitation and how the state reacts to it that one can see the confidence or these alliance of these groups with the state, as it were. It is then in the notion of blasphemy and the rise of these, and the recent rise of these Sunni religious demagogues that we see regularly tolerated, if not fully supported or openly supported by the Pakistani military and intelligence apparatus, that we can identify the contours of a new political and social order and the disciplining or the regulation of public speech in the public sphere. And as I said before, I don't have time here to go into detail, but digital social media is playing a central role here. And when I say digital vigilantism, I'm speaking of how it's defined as in the way in which citizens are watching other citizens on social media, right? And this is where what I say, there's a new liberal alliance of surveillance, citizenship, religion, and state, because they're watching for blasphemous speech, but also for what becomes the anti-national commentaries and satire, and they alert then state authorities to them, right? So here it's the digital vigilantism is often complemented with conventional types of vigilantism, right? So, and this is what I call the new regime of self-regulation and surveillance, where the state is often at the at the outside and often is pull in. So there had been okay, so let me see how am I doing with time here, and all right, so
you have a few more minutes.
A few minutes, okay, great. So there had been acts of collective violence and targeted killings of alleged blasphemers and their lawyers and allies before, but however, it was in the disappearance of 5 of these activists that I referenced at the start of the paper that demonstrated blasphemy's emergence as a political theological domain of censorship and discipline, and as well as of governing and managing public emotions in Pakistan. The disappearance of these activists and the allegations of blasphemy show how state-backed institutions have recognized and stepped in to manage religious emotions. They do this not only by regulating emotions through the application of blasphemy laws, but also by punishing the blasphemers' supposed transgression via extrajudicial means as a form of violence at the threshold of legality and illegality, which seeks legitimacy from the higher or divine principles of sovereignty, right? Not only from the rule of law and all that, right? So therefore, it's not only in the post-colonial blasphemy laws that we can recognize the conjunction of divine and temporal in the reconstitution of sovereign power. See, the commitment of uniting divine and republican sources of sovereignty into criminal sanctions does not only materialize on the side of formal and penal law. The alignment of the divine with the earthly power also takes place on the extrajudicial and exceptional side of violence and justice, delivered again in the name of divine powers. And I just have a couple of other notes by way of conclusion. So what does all that then say about the question of sovereignty or state sovereignty in the colonial and then in the post-colonial context, and specifically in the historical South Asian context, right? So the colonial claim to sovereignty rested upon an assumed benevolence of the rule of law as a universal tool of governance to fix political and economic social issues in South Asia. By the end of the 19th century, the rule of law had become a byword for the justification of colonialism in India, right? Law was viewed not only as an institution for adjudicating conflicts, but rather as a representation of the higher principles of self-controlled civilization, modernity, and rationality. The competing ideas, sites, and practices of sovereignty, such as the tribal or religious one, were either regulated through law. So then you had Muslim family law and Hindu family law, and then of course blasphemy laws, or they were outlawed altogether. Therefore, liberal legality, the rule of law, the rule of judiciary and courts, etc., served to cement the British claim of exercising sovereignty against what they alleged was the arbitrary and personalized exercise of power by local rulers, right? So other sources of sovereignty were, as I've said, were either outlawed or, incorporated in the law itself. It served to expand colonial rule across the Indian, princely states that exist and eventually defined the borders of empire through its opposites. So the opposites were the idioms of the lawlessness and excess that existed outside of this state, right? So the early colonials, excuse me. So the early colonials considered the principally, and I've said, tribal local authority holders to be despotic and corrupt, since the local legal systems they assumed lacked due process procedure and thus could not impart justice. They claimed to replace the local rulers' arbitrary exercise of authority and justice with the rationality and uniformity of their own legal rule. The depersonalized, the deprivatized, and defeudalized of legal authority played a central role in establishing the model colonial state in India. So the legalization and bureaucratization of the state took place simultaneously, and the rule of law and constitutional rule and the higher rules then all figured centrally in how the state authority was depersonalized in that sense, right? So in one way, and this is just to, I'll just end after this, in one way, what I'm looking at is how there has been a crisis of sovereignty at the start, because on the one hand, the post-colonial state inherited this bureaucratic legal structure, which was based on a certain idea of rationality and modernity and what law could do, but it was also about how to manage these populations who were considered unruly and so on, right? So there's this crisis of the post-colonial state, which when when Pakistan emerges as this, a state that is comes into being in the name of Islam and Muslim rule and so on, right? But still carries that. How does it negotiates these tensions with it? And that is an ongoing process, because blasphemy laws itself has now, I would argue that they become so central to it, but at the same time, what is outside of these laws and how they interact together to, as I've said before, to bring two principles of sovereignty, the secular and divine, together, but through these forms of vigilante violence, right? So anyway, it's a work in progress. So I look forward to your comments, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I look forward to read more about your project, because yesterday too we discussed about the conjunction between the divine and earthly in both in keynote speech and in Sebastian's talk, from a very different context, in the context of Colombia. So I think it's a very important topic in understanding vigilantism, and also the crisis of sovereignty, not only in the post-colony and in the ongoing settler colonial contexts, but apparently in Europe is also an important matter to address. So it's an excellent panel, which I am really looking forward to the Q&A session, but also I am looking forward to Martijn's comments, who has been working on religion and vigilantism and security for some time. I'm sure he has a lot to reflect on. Before giving the floor to Martijn, I'll briefly introduce him to you. He's one of the co-organizers of this workshop and also co-conveners of the Anthropology of Crime network, which brought us here together. Martijn acquired his PhD at the Amsterdam School of Social Science Research at University of Amsterdam, and since 2014, he is an associate professor at the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Utrecht University. And he has published extensively on religion, media, and the city in Brazil and also in Europe. And his research focuses, among other things, on urban and religious transformations in Brazil in relation to security and insecurity, and the widespread use of mass media and popular culture. And he is also the principal investigator of the ERC Consolidated Research Project titled Sacralizing Security, Religion, Violence, and Authority in Megacities of the Global South. So, floor is yours, Martijn.
Thank you very much, Denise. And I want to thank all the three presenters, first and foremostly, for giving these wonderful presentations and also handing in very elaborate papers that I was able to read. And I think for each of the papers also not only gives a beautiful ethnographic description, but also adds to our theoretical discussions and questions our conceptual apparatus. So I'll do my best to highlight some of these, but maybe cannot do justice to all of their great insights. So I have two general points that, as by way of sort of linking the papers, but also continuing some discussions that we started out with yesterday. And then I have some individual points for each presenter. So by and large, I would say the discussion that started yesterday with the talk also of Jean Komarov really brings to the fore a kind of relation, or the question of the relation between, let's say, religion as a kind of reproduction of the sacred, or religion as the sacred, and religion as a discursive or performative tradition with particular histories. So even though all of you in the paper, you do your best to conceptualize these as not similar, not the same, frequently they move from one to the other. So I'm saying this because, as I will say in a minute, I think we are often caught up in a kind of difficult attempt to both keep alive anthropological notions of the sacred that are constitutive of political communities, but we also want to discuss how these political communities are informed by religious traditions. And mostly, I think what we're trying to do is to see how these interact with each other historically. Nevertheless, in all of your papers, there's sometimes a bit of a conceptual unclarity. So it goes back and forth between these notions. And I'll try to be specific in just a minute. So I would say, if we go back to as some of you do, to the notion of the foundation of the state as a kind of miraculous moment or so, or as a following the Smithian notion of this constitution of the political community as a kind of quasi-religious act, we can see how the nation state has in itself a kind of incessant or continuing sacred element to it, even though these nation state might be prefigured as a kind of secular or liberal. And I think some of you use liberal, and I would ask for some clarity because I think I would often call them secularists. So for me, what's important is actually how in that defining moment of the nation state, the category of religion became used to distinguish certain practices, certain groups, and to disempower them vis-a-vis a particular political community and its governance. And I think there we might be a bit more precise. So I think here, what strikes me is how in all of your papers, there's a continuous kind of maybe moment of the need for a kind of political theology in which the nation state is confronted by a loss of sovereignty and tries to reestablish itself with a kind of divine sacred act. And I think that's why we were discussing yesterday also this kind of notion of the divine, I would say. At the same time, we see that many of the states that you are talking to are actually, although presented themselves as constitutionally liberal, they often are already quasi-religious in the sense that they have incorporated religious traditions really as part of the nation. So they could, in layman's terms, people identify often the state as being Buddhist or being Islamic. So I think here we should make that clearer to how actually they might be projected as liberal or as secularist, but in the same time, there's a continuing notion that the political community is actually religious in the sense. So I think that for me, that it deserves a bit more clarity in all of your papers, or maybe you could say something about it. And then I'll say something why in each of the presentations, why I think it's interesting or important. So that was one first general point. The second point is, I could do it a bit quicker. I think what we also touched upon yesterday was the question of a kind of proliferation of media. So if we want to think a little bit more about the resurgence of religion, I think we should do that in relation to a kind of resurgence of the possibility to produce kind of these communities of affect, as I sometimes call them. I think, Salman, you rightly point to emotions as a very powerful element of let's say, the violence or the justification of violence. But I think in each of the papers, media and kind of the way in which communities can present themselves is very also important. So I will say something about that in each of the cases now. So, but I would like to think with you, with all of us. So if we want to think about how the state reenacts itself, I think it's becoming increasingly impossible to think that without understanding how there's a certain performativity mediatized, but also how groups that are related to the state constantly react to that mediatization, or how they are in a kind of dialogue with that. And you can see that very clearly also, for instance, in the paper by Marcos, which I like very much. And I think it relates a little bit to the notions of the relational aspect of vigilantism, or as Marcos calls it, is tactical vigilantism. Okay, so these are two general points. I think we could do more with these questions. And then maybe to each of the papers quickly. Geethika, I loved your paper. I really thought it was so interesting that you focused on the hunger strike, and I enjoyed very much your reference to Bataille amongst others. Yet I also have some questions if you can't push the use of Bataille a bit further even here. So I think it's crucial, but as I remember, so it's been a while since I read this piece by Bataille, it's also the notion of kind of self-sacrifice, no, in Bataille that generates a certain power. So to relinquish that which is most valuable is actually is what constitutes also power for Bataille, if I remember well. So it's not just sort of a power to destroy other lives, but in general to destroy, or the willingness in your case, to destroy what is most valuable to the actor, him or herself. So the fact that he wants to sacrifice itself and that this is mediatized as a believable act is what actually it seems to generate this power. So so I was wondering, that seems to be a bit different than from what you describe in the paper, in which you say that it goes against the kind of religious sanctification, which is a Buddhist tradition that you should not destroy life in general. But this seems to me a little bit different. So here again, I'm asking, like, how can we think about the divine moment in the more anthropological sense of the sacred, the willingness to sacrifice oneself, and then how it translates actually to the religious tradition. So how is that? Because they are not the same. And then, of course, the question is how it kind of starts to circulate in relation to these other rituals. Just as a very minor point, one might ask, why is it not perceived heresy what he's doing? So why is he not going against? So if apparently the public embraces his act as something that is benevolent, whereas he's also acting against certain notions of what is to be a proper Buddhist life. So, but this is a minor point. But thank you again. I think with Marcos, I was very struck, and I also loved your kind of bringing in the notion of the Catholic Church, but mostly the imaginary of the olive branch held by the dove. And here I also was wondering a little bit, is it not also is it not a very potent ambivalence of this symbol, that it communicates both peace but also the possibility of destruction? And you say that at some point, but it is not entirely clear. You seem to focus very much on the signification of peace and of kind of the peacefulness of the demonstrators. But actually, I would say it's kind of riddled with tensions. No, there's this threat actually of destruction that they seem also to communicate slightly, but the fact that they have machetes but not guns, but they have guns hidden. So there's a constant kind of underplay of the violence that it seems to me also part of a longer Catholic tradition or a Christian tradition. That yes, peaceful, but violence if necessary. So I think I think you could say more about it, or I would love you to say more. Then lastly, Salman, also very your piece is very rich. I think there's so much going on that really deserves more attention. For you, I have a question. So at some point you quote Aretsaga, in which you sort of put the state as a product of rational technologies vis-a-vis this constant access that the state needs to reproduce itself. But I wonder, I'm not sure if you should put that in terms of rationality vis-a-vis access, at least not in the piece. I think in your talk it was already a bit more layered. But I was wondering if it's, so I like very much this work by Judith Butler, in which she interrogates sort of the relationship between Foucault's notion of governmentality and Agamben's notion of sovereignty. And she doesn't put them as opposites. She puts them very much as a tandem. So within governmentality, which you could say has a certain rationality to it, there is always the sovereign act there. So there's always the sovereign act which is ready to reproduce actually the governmentality. So you need these kind of figures that go beyond the law to reproduce the governmentality that, according to Butler, Foucault describes. So I think here, I'm not sure if you would need the notion of the rational. So I don't think, for me, it may be less productive than trying to understand, as I said earlier, how sort of the state is constantly producing the miraculous, but that is not, for me, not necessarily irrational. So I would say. Lastly, for you, I think it's very interesting if we think about the fact that not just in, I think in Pakistan, but similar examples we see in Indonesia, where a certain secularist law that was used to some extent to rule, so these blasphemy rules also were in place to somehow pacify religious upheavals in such a way, of course, under a Christian banner in many cases, under the British, but there was a notion of a sort of to protect certain minorities and to make sure that they could rule. But now we see actually that these so-called minorities were often already the majority culture, they're using these kinds of blasphemy laws to protect the majority, to make sure that they can act against even smaller minorities or so. In this case, maybe leftist liberals. Okay, so I should stop there. I hope these questions can lead to some discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martijn, for this really great and generous comments. And yeah, Geethika can start.
Oh, thank you, Martijn. It's very, very nice to hear what you said. But so the first question about, the relationship between the nation state and the origin of nation state and religion. I think when you especially like the colonial states, like post-colonial states, it's always like. When you think about like South Asia, like especially South Asia in the context that I'm familiar with, before even this like religion or this like religious self, or there is this tradition, right? So that when you start with the nation state, though there is a rupture. Like when the origin of nation state, or the British came in and they started organizing the society in the way that they have imagined, but like after the post-colonial state especially, they had to incorporate what was already there, right? Of course, it's not that like I'm not saying that this essential religious being there always, but there was a way that the society was organized in people's mind, and then these elite groups that were gained the education, like this, like the missionary or whatever the education, but they also after that, as when it comes to the power game, they mobilize certain sentiments. The Sinhalese in Sri Lankan case, Sinhalese majority, like naturally the nation states are this, like it is based on this majoritarian idea, right? So then the majority inherently like the Sinhalese, and they incorporate this religious and ethnic identity. For them, it was kind of, I could say, the democracy defined in terms of religious and ethnic terms, because the Sinhalese would start the majority of the country, and it favors the elite who were there. So that then in that sense, political community created, and also this, their language became the foremost place, the majority language, and then the religion, of course, around like 1956. I mean, it's all over the world. It's not only these countries actually. So this majoritarian idea, religion came in to incorporate, into the constitution, and all these, these things are happening. And I like when you said like, yeah, it took a kind of a, rather than saying it's religious, I would say also could use like secular, like, right, it's a kind of secular formation, as David Scott also talked about it. But answering, and that's my, the answering the first, your first point about the relationship between the origin of nation state and the religion and how it relates to the creating a political community. The question on Bataille and how I have tried to incorporate the Bataille's idea as, you know, this like sacrificing yourself. Again, like the main point I want to make in the paper is that so when you try to understand certain authorities, certain forces, certain like, you know, forms of violence in a given society, it's better if you look at how they have legitimized, like what kind of a legitimizing framework, or what kind of like get rid of legitimize, what kind of framework that they use to understand their world around. Right. So for me, it's like there is this traditionally, there are forces behind, there are forces in any given society that already has been kind of already has this kind of certain authority. Right. They can enable violence, and then it is a kind of like they're already there. It's a condition, as a condition of possibility that can enable the violence because they are a force. Right. And when you look at that, like I would say in Sri Lankan context, it is, you know, Sinhala Buddhist tradition is there. The Sangha has this certain kind of authority, and they, so because of this tradition, they know that the state cannot sacrifice them. Right? The people think that they are something that you cannot sacrifice, especially these aliens, Muslims. Right, because of like, you know, so because now or the Tamils, because they are always outsiders, they have always portrayed as outsiders. So in that sense, even so basically like what I want to say is like this sacrificial. I want to hear more about like what you actually mean by when I have like the way I have used this sacredness is different from Bataille's. I want to hear more, but like in general, what I want to say is like this sacredness. He's, of course, it's against religion, right? Like the Buddhism, but in religious tradition, the Sinhala Buddhist tradition, it has been legitimized, right? You have to protect the country. You have to protect the religion or the Buddhism, right? So that discourse is there. And then doing these things also, monks keep that discourse alive, right? So they're performing this like, you know, I'm willing to die, you know, and in that case, like, I mean, in that sense also, they are creating or performing this sacredness. I am willing to die, and then the state or the society, you know, the Sinhala Buddhist majoritarian society, they know that these monks cannot be sacrificed. So I like, yeah, that's how I try to like frame in that way. And also like the legitimizing framework, I thought like, you know, it's important whenever, what do we call, like, how do we call certain things vigilante practices, and then some of them are not, right? So then for me, even in like the violence, especially violence, like, so in my paper, in like, you know, in my mind, I was trying to discuss this force, authority, legitimacy, violence, and these concepts, how these, the way, like in some kind of a way to understand these analytical concepts. One single example I'll give, like, you know, in American context, right? So when that's why I'm saying that we need to look into this legitimizing framework, how this violence has been legitimized in American context. When they so the violence, for example, against Black community, you know, it's just that there is a discourse going on. Like, it's not easy to do violence when you do it. Like, it just there's this certain kind of discourse there, and then people come out, do protest and all these things. But when they attack Middle Eastern countries, right? So the majority of the Democrats, they don't care about that. They don't come to the road. They're not like saying that, like, you let them live there. You don't have anything to do that. So in a way, for me, it's like certain kind of violence has been legitimized within the given structure, right? For certain violence are not legitimized, right? Like, so you cannot do, people come out, but certain ones, people don't care. So yeah, so that's basically what I wanted to say. Yeah, thank you. I hope I made sense.
Well, so thank you for the questions. I guess before answering your points, I would basically want to reiterate that I'm approaching this from the perspective of the existing literature on vigilantism in Mexico and in Michoacán, which has really downplayed the influence of religion with respect to the vigilante groups, but in some cases has emphasized the religiosity of cartels. So I could talk about that, extensively, but so a lot of the literature on vigilantism on community self-defense groups has really downplayed religion, though there are a couple people who are beginning to talk about this. So I really want to kind of emphasize this in my discussion, because I think it's so relevant to the case of Ucareo and so different from what we've seen in a lot of the other scholarship that exists. With respect to the question of the state and religion, I'll try and be really brief. But so we have the history of colonialism with Spain. We have the formation of and dissemination of Catholicism as a replacement for indigenous religions. Ucareo becomes one of the bases for the Augustinian order, and then the Franciscans. They build a monastery in Ucareo, and so it becomes a kind of regional pillar for Catholicism, and a site of recruitment for the comunidades indígenas, for the indigenous communities, and for their evangelization. We go through, get to the independence period. We have, Mexico becoming its own nation state. We have all of these contestations across the 1800s between the liberals and the conservatives. The liberals really emphasizing the attempt to engage the Catholic Church in land redistribution. So to really kind of strip away a lot of the assets that they've accumulated over centuries, and to engage in a more kind of productive redistribution of lands. We get to the Mexican Revolution in the early 20th century. And this sets up a couple administrations that are very, very secularist in orientation. And so the constitution that emerges from the Mexican Revolution is hyper secular. And in fact, the first couple of administrations very actively attempt to ban, really take efforts to prohibit Catholicism in the public domain. This triggers in Michoacán what's called the Cristero War. And it's a war that kind of emerges across Western Mexico and that links very conservative peasant communities with the Catholic hierarchy to push back against the secularist socialistic state. And so there's battles that take place across Michoacán. Some of the people from Ucareo, I happened to interview someone who was 104 before she died, and her father participated in the Cristero War, and so she remembers some of these histories. But the Cristeros were supposed to be secrets. They kind of kept their allegiances disguised because of the potential punishment from states and from state-backed militia forces, which leads me to my second point, which is the Agrarian Reform. So in addition to the Cristero War, there's also this push for land redistribution. So basically expropriating land from the haciendas and from the plantation owners and redistributing them to the peasants. This occurs in a very extensive fashion in Michoacán, including in the Ucareo Valley where I work. There were two main haciendas that were redistributed. So this provokes tensions, right, in my community and across Michoacán more broadly between those ejidatarios, those people who benefit from the land reforms, and those people who are, come from private property families. The Catholic Church supported private property and took a very aggressive stance against land redistribution. So we have, like, kind of in Ucareo and other communities across Mexico, this ongoing tension, even present to today, a kind of religious land-based tension between, on the one hand, people who benefited from land reform and those people who are, private property owning families. Across the 20th century, we have these ongoing conflicts, but basically the state, the secular, takes a kind of accommodations perspective with respect to the Catholic Church. And then eventually, once we have electoral democratization that happens in the year 2000, we have one political party, the PUN, which is the right-wing party that really represents the Catholic Church. And the other parties are either much more kind of secularist in their orientation or take more accommodationist perspectives. In terms of your second question about affects, I would approach that thinking about the scholarship on what are called atmospherics of terror. I'm thinking of the work of Sarah Luna here on the US-Mexico border. And kind of these atmospheres of terror that circulate that are produced by cartels and by organized crime that lead to intimidation. And this is something I definitely have seen in my field site in Ucareo and in Michoacán more broadly, though I would caution against overemphasizing the terroristic component. One of the things that I found interesting about where I'm working is that the cartels took a very more kind of minimalistic governmental perspective or relationship to the population as compared to other parts of the state, right? So in other parts of the state with traditions of drug cultivation, so growing marijuana, growing poppies for heroin, and also having a laboratory set up for the production of meth, there's a much kind of deeper history of this. And so both kind of a kind of Cosa Nostra type of perspective here, where there's an attempt by a lot of these cartels to develop deep roots through social services, through the provision of social services, through the building of legitimacy, but also in some cases by the use of very explicit terror tactics. It's very different in the East where I work. It was a much more kind of bland administration, a much more bland type of governmentality, though they did engage in extortion and in resource pillaging to a certain extent, right? And I try and tease that out in different works I do. But this all kind of provides the basis, the affective basis of intimidation and terror for the formation of these self-defense forces, right? For the vigilante forces in where I work and also in other parts of the state. And in the case of Ucareo, really kind of blending religiosity, a kind of shared religiosity with a shared kind of peasant background, peasant economic background, to fuse these together to create a kind of common a community of affect, as you might say, that then is mobilized and used as the basis for kind of building support. One of the interesting things that I didn't talk about in the paper is the fact that the media love this. They love the fact that there's this kind of quaint traditional town where they still like rung the church bells and people assembled in the town square. So the media, the international media would arrive, and ask the leaders to kind of reenact this for the cameras. And so the leaders, complied because they thought this was going to be great media, a kind of media, hit for them. So they rung the emergency church bells, and of course they have cameras positioned in the streets, and they're filming all the people kind of moving up the cobblestone streets to assemble in the town square for the public forum, right? For the discussion. And so they, just kind of recycling these tropes of traditional Catholicism and this kind of what I call dignified agrarianism, right? For the cameras. And then lastly, your last point about the olive branch and this kind of ambiguous symbolism. Yeah, that's a great point. Something I'll need to think about. Certainly it kind of is anchored in this deeper history of insurgency and its kind of fraught intersection with religion in Mexico. So on the one hand, the kind of history of conflict and paramilitary militia activity where I work emerged really in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. After the land redistribution, the hacienda owners created paramilitary forces to terrorize the populace. And so there was a kind of agrarian militia that these ejidatarios, these peasants, had to form a group to oppose this. And so there's these ongoing conflicts, relating to religion, relating to politics, relating to land reform that really kind of continue across the 20th century, and then are eventually tied up in border disputes, forest, illegal logging, and other things. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks so much for your rich and insightful comments, and I'll be quick, or as quick as possible. Yeah, so about religion as from a performative perspective and as sacred, and I think that is one of the things I think that is kind of implicit in the paper is the tension between these two, right? How the state itself negotiates this. Because on the one hand, state itself claims to be this, to have this mythical birth, right? Which is in a Durkheimian sense, like that is the sacred. But at the same time, and as you very, rightly alluded to, mentioned the Indonesian case in the comparative sense, like what was meant in a very different historical context, to protect a religious minority now becomes, to protect the majority. And I think that's an excellent point, and I've made a note here to think more about that. So that is that. So now if we take this a bit further into what I was calling digital, I think I'm taking it from others, digital vigilantism, which I was not able to go into, of course, into that much detail, and how that performance of religion on the one hand is, of course, state is the background, but also at the same time, it is producing new kind of religious publics, in a way, right? So the question of emotion then becomes really interesting here, is that you're looking at a way in which these emotions, and what I was saying before is that if you look at how law itself is also about emotions, right? So what you do, so when I'm talking about rationality and all that, I'm speaking of in the colonial context, which was in which, well, there are rational ways in which public emotions or religious emotions can be governed, right? So when the question of governmentality, which again, rightly so, is a governmentalization of religion in the post-colonial period, but it has that defining of boundaries, or somehow to assume that on the one hand you have these like unruly emotional crowds who are burning and all that, on the other hand you have the rational law that is able to, that is, I think, a fallacy, and I think that's what I'm trying to. So the sacred versus performative, like these are these tensions in between that are and as I said, these are unresolved tensions. Now, the problem is that, of course, taking the historical perspective, and what I was alluding to before is that the rise of traditional middle classes. And when I say traditional middle classes, these are the classes that are more and more active on social media. And they are the one that are, in a way, always pulling the state in, as I was saying, so on the one hand, of course, there is a new confluence of security, surveillance, and citizenship, but but at the same time, religion and state are both pulled, so there are these tensions that don't have, as I've said before, don't have these clear boundaries in a way that we think, that somehow all of this is contained in a sense. And then, of course, the potential for violence is built always in there. And I think that's the other point that I wasn't, I think, able to come across, that when we think of digital vigilantism, and it's based on blasphemous speech, hate speech, and so on, it has the potential for conventional vigilantism and violence always built into it, and it goes into, because the incidents that I alluded to, they started from social media, so there is these very interesting I would say we can speak of it in the language of governmentalization of religion as well. And so the minority and the majority, I think that is the most interesting question now, is that, well, the majority itself is not what the state, because the state, when we think of the Pakistani state, there's this question of blasphemy and religious minorities goes back to the time where the state itself, came into being, right? And that has remained in a kind of unresolved question, but weaponization of blasphemy is that way in which there's this, when I was saying that there is this reminder always, there is this reminder through violence that there are these boundaries that should be reinforced again and again. So violence through all these processes, which are layered, as I think I was trying to, get at it. These are these layered things, through which they, but all of this kind of drops down to, and that's what I was saying before, is that when you when you read these legal cases and rulings and so on, you'll find that the judges who are actually dealing with these cases, they are, I mean, and the way they are doing this, they're very much taking into account these ideas is that, well, we have to manage these emotions in a way, in the sense that the state is not left out in that sense, right? So the state is always part of it, is that they recognize. So, for example, just last point, they very much recognize the provocation of emotions, right? Provocation of emotion. Now, this is something that's part of the criminal law itself, right? I mean, you have various degrees of violence. But when you read these rulings, they're like, well, yeah, we recognize that people will be provoked, and they'll act collectively. You know, so these recognition by the law itself is very interesting, because it's not only simply to say that, well, yeah, the violence is, legitimated, but there is something else at play here, which is built within the blasphemy law itself. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at, is that when you're looking at these excess or rationality and all that, there are these like boundaries are porous in that sense. Anyway, I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the answers, comprehensive answers again. And I'm opening the floor for questions. Errol, you have a question? Okay. Then